Welcome to Truth and Liberty. Thank you for joining our daily live call-in broadcast, where trusted leaders bring biblical insights to the issues, and you can call in and get your questions answered in real time. According to the Bible, it's the truth you know that sets you free. So call in today to get answers, information, and resources to help you stand for truth and effect godly change in our nation and the world. And now here's your host, Richard Harris.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Truth and Liberty Show. So great to have you watching today, July 10th. Last week, we completed the Summer Family Bible Conference here at Harris Bible College, and it was a great time. I got to minister and gave a message on the faith of America, and so I want to encourage you to go onto the AWMI website and find the conference archives and listen to that message. It was Tuesday mornings, and you know, it was just the response to it was phenomenal. But what's really important is the bottom line of what I was talking about, guys, was that it's important for us as believers to have faith for our country. That, you know, we've got to be careful that we don't get caught up in all of the left-wing negative news all the time. You know, it can really be discouraging and can make you sour. David Barton calls it the 10 Spies Network, you know. We got to not listen to those 10 spies and listen to the two good ones who had the good report. God has a plan for this country, and He's not done. There are great things happening, and but He does it through us, and He does it, the Lord does, through our faith. And we need to be the ones holding the banner high and bringing hope to the people of this country for a better and a brighter future. You know, the Marxists, the leftists, the LGBT, progressives, all these folks, the whole conglomerate of left-wing constituent groups, you know what they have in common? They have victimhood and envy at the core of their philosophy. Everything they're about is victimhood and envy. And you know, there's a better way, and it's the way of freedom, the way of truth, the way of hope for the future. And so I want to encourage you to watch that message. Hey, the other thing I wanted to tell you guys about is that coming up September 12th through the 14th, here at Harris Bible College in Woodland Park, we're going to have the annual Truth and Liberty Conference. And it's going to be an awesome time. If you're not registered, you need to make plans to come now. Dr. Ben Carson is going to be speaking. It's going to be awesome having him as a guest and hearing his message. Also, Rick Green, the founder of Patriot Academy. Bill Federer, American Minute, one of our board members and a great friend, will be ministering. Pastor Che Ahn of Harvest Fellowship in California, a great new friend, and you know, he stands for freedom all the time. And also I'm going to be sharing Marjorie Dannenfelser of SBA List, Andrew Womack, of course, and also Luke Ball, who's a frequent guest, an up-and-coming young conservative leader, and also a new friend of mine named Torben Sondergaard, who's a Dutch evangelist who got imprisoned in the United States for 18 months in the United States of America for his faith. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. That's what it was about. He's going to share if we can make the connection. He can't come into America, so we're going to video connect with him from Brazil or wherever he is at the moment. But I wanted to mention to you that we're going to have a special event for Truth and Liberty members at the outset of the conference, or just before it begins on Thursday afternoon. And we're going to have a premiere screening or showing of a new movie that we're creating here called Hope for the Future. Here's the cover of the product. It's not out yet. It'll be out in September, but Hope for the Future. And this tells the story of the three prophetic words that the Lord has ministered through Andrew Womack in the last 3 years about America, beginning with the revelation that we are already in the third great awakening. I remember so clearly when Andrew said that on March the 5th, 2021, and I thought to myself, oh, Andrew, I hope you're really hearing from God, because this doesn't look like an awakening to me. Joe Biden had just won the election. The January 6th thing had already happened, and everybody's being tracked down. Deplatforming of all of the president and of Parler, which is going to be relevant to my guest today. So many other things were happening, and he heard from the Lord say that, and now we see the evidence breaking all around us that God is on the move. So you're going to want to get this video. It's going to be a super encouragement to you, but also you can do it by becoming a Truth and Liberty member. Just go to our website and sign up if you're not already to make an automatic recurring gift of $5 or more per month, and you'll help us to equip the church church, mobilize the church to stand for truth in the public square. All right, guys, listen, I have a really great guest on with me now. Is going to be joining us, first timer on Truth and Liberty and a new friend. His name is Mark Meckler, and Mark is one of these guys behind the scenes that has done so much to revitalize the conservative movement in America. He's actually the president of an organization called Convention of States Foundation and Convention of States Action, which is an organization that is calling for a constitutional convention to propose amendments, not to scrap the Constitution, but to make some important changes. And also, he was one of the original founders of the Tea Party movement back, in 2009, when Obama was still brand new president. And we're going to talk about that today, about this Convention of States and other things. Mark is an experienced attorney, interim CEO of Parler, and just a patriotic American. I'm really proud and thankful to welcome you on the show today, Mark. Thanks for coming on the program.
Man, I'm so glad to be with you. I had a chance to be at Harris College not too long ago where we met. That was my first visit, and I was blown away. What a beautiful place, and what a great place to base the revitalization of America. I can't imagine a better place to do that.
Oh, thanks, Mark. It was great meeting you there. That was our annual awards banquet, and Riley Gaines was our keynote speaker, and we gave out some awards there for believers who are standing up for their faith. We have a great view here of Pikes Peak, and Pikes Peak is called America's Mountain, and it was also where Catherine Lee Bates wrote America the Beautiful. And so it really is a special place here. I think it's God ordained, and we're just so honored and blessed to be able to serve the Lord here, and I'm honored to have you on the show. Well, brother, you were one, as I said in your introduction, you were one of the original founders of the Tea Party movement back in, 2009, and Obama elected in 2008, and he holds himself out as just a regular old liberal, even called himself a Christian, the lying thing that he is. But then he began to radically transform this country. No one really on the right or in the center had any idea what his real agenda was. And when we began to see it, it was horrifying to true liberty-loving Americans. Tell us how you got involved, and not involved because I'm sure you already were, but what caused you to start the Tea Party movement? I know you weren't alone in it, but you were certainly one of the principals.
Yeah, actually, I think you're more accurate in saying what caused me to get involved, because I was completely uninvolved. And, it's a classic grassroots story. I hadn't done anything politically in my life. I was a lawyer. I was occupied, as so many conservatives are, working, raising my family. I was living in the mountains of Northern California. But I saw what was happening in our country, and I was really frustrated. I'd voted always, but that was it. And so when I saw what was happening, there was actually a moment, which is a guy by the name of Rick Santelli did a rant on CNBC, and he called for a new Tea Party, and Rush Limbaugh picked that up. It went viral. It was the early days of things going viral. And I saw that and said, we ought to do something about this. I heard that people were getting together and they're planning on holding some tea parties around the country. My wife and I did an event in Sacramento, California. That's in February of that year. And most people don't even know what was going on in February. We had about 150 people show up at the Capitol. I was blown away that there were 148 other crazy conservatives in California who showed up. And then out of that, I started reaching around the country and meeting a bunch of others. And we decided to do that event over again with more notice. We had a week notice for that one. We gave ourselves about 6 weeks, and we planned the April 15th Tax Day Tea Party. That's the one that really launched the Tea Party movement. 1.2 million people came out at 850 events around the country. And I went from being a absolutely private citizen who nobody knew to being a public figure overnight. Kind of turned my life on its head. I
bet it did. Mark, it harkens me back to, I can't remember exactly the name of it, but there was a massive protest march in Washington when the Obamacare was being voted on. And right. I took my wife and my kids. We actually went to that and were there. And Tea Party played a big role in it. I'm not sure if it was official or not, but it just reminds me of how devastating the Obama years were. And, the sad thing to me, I think, is that most Americans now, of course, that was I don't know when that rally was, 2009, 2010, but it's now been, 14 years, 15 years, and
Right, 15 years.
I'm afraid that Americans now are kind of settling into maybe a new normal of progressivism and of pseudo-Marxism in our country, and accepting these things that used to be unthinkable and everybody knew it was contrary to American values. Where do we stand now in America, do you think? Has the Tea Party movement achieved what it wanted, or how far short has it fallen? Are we in a better place now than when Obama was elected, or a worse place?
I'm going to say it's both. I hate to equivocate like a politician, but
That's
I would
okay.
say
You're a lawyer. I'll let you.
it's much better in the sense, Andrew, is that we have, Richard, that we have all these platforms where real information is getting out to the average person. People can tune into you and your show and dozens of others like it and get real, unbiased, unfiltered information. Back in the Tea Party days, we didn't have that. I mean, it was pretty much Rush Limbaugh, Fox News, and that was it. And so I think there's a lot more reality being spread around. I think that's very healthy. I don't think the mainstream media has the influence or power it once had, so I think that's a lot better. I would also say, as a person of faith, that I see over the last 15 years a great awakening taking place in America. I travel all over the country. I've been in 49 states so far, and everywhere I go, I meet new Christians, or I meet old Christians whose hearts are new with the Lord and are on fire for the Lord. People who are taking action as opposed to just saying that they're Christians. So I think spiritually, at its root, the country is in a much healthier place. And I know that's contrarian. Like, a lot of people look out, they watch TV and they see the porn and the filth and the darkness in the schools, and all that's going on. I'm not Pollyanna-ish, but I believe that an equal or greater measure of light is rising in the country right now.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Mark. On Pentecost Sunday this year, there were 12 to 16,000 people got baptized off California beaches. And, it's like another headline that comes and goes, but I was like, holy moly, that is awesome. I mean, what is going on? Is there really a revival, a move of God taking place? And I think there is, and it's an extended process. David Barton taught us that revival awakenings, as opposed to just isolated revivals, awakenings usually take decades. It's not a sudden thing. It takes a long time. And the thing that blew my mind is, he said the people that are in them usually don't know they're in them. It's the historians looking back who say, yeah, that was the second great awakening in America.
I've had that same conversation with David, and I asked him, and I think he said this publicly, what do you think George Whitefield thought when he was riding around the country and he was in the middle of the Great Awakening? And he said, I think he probably thought, man, this is hard. It's like, because he was in it. He was riding thousands of miles on horseback, carrying his pulpit with him everywhere he went, through freezing cold, through heat, through wind, rain. That's not easy, and it doesn't feel glorious when you're going through it. And like you said, I think historians look back and say, oh, now we know what was going on during that period. And I really, truly believe that's happening right now.
And Whitefield too, it wasn't like he didn't have opposition. A lot of people didn't like what he was doing, especially the religious establishment of the day fought against that stuff. And so, nothing's new under the sun. Well, Mark,
I agree.
Speaking of new Christians that you've met, you were sharing with me, I did not know this just before we went live, that you're actually, you're Jewish, and that you came to know Christ within the last, I don't know how many years, right? Not too long ago. And
I'm 62 years old, and I was saved when I was 51, so it's now been 11 years. I was blessed with a wife that's always been a believer. And it sounds impossible, but I came to Christ through politics. And I know most people lose their soul in politics. It's a very dark place. But for me, Richard, I was traveling all over the country, and I was doing conservative politics. And if you do that, everywhere you go, you are going to cross paths with righteous Christians. It's just part of the movement. And so I had the opportunity to meet people like Mike Ferris and Rick Green and David Barton, James Dobson. And every time I met somebody like that, I would ask them, why? Why are you the way that you are? Politics is a dark business and a dirty business. And when you cross paths with people, I met Dr. Dobson sitting at a dinner, sitting around a table with a bunch of very important people, ambassadors, senators. Honestly, I don't even remember who else because Dr. Dobson made such an impression on me. And at one point, I was noticing that he wouldn't talk about himself. Everybody at the table wanted to tell their story and tell how important they were. And Dobson was encouraging this in everybody. And people would ask him stuff, and he would just turn the conversation, oh, that's not important. How did you become ambassador to Germany? And I remember looking at him thinking, I don't understand that. Like, I don't know what that is. I don't see that in the world very much. Here's this incredibly important guy who's ministered to millions of people, presidents, prime ministers, and he's making himself small and making everybody else big. And I thought, I want that. Like, whatever that is, I'm just super attracted to that. And over time, I met more and more people like that. I started asking questions. Finally, I had a guy who's become a deep personal friend and mentor just ask me point blank, hey, what do you know about being Jewish? And I thought, I don't even know what that means. You know, my mom made matzo ball soup. It's very surface for me. Yeah. And he said, look, that's one of the most important stories in history. We know the whole story. It's your story, story of your people. I'm actually 93% European Jew, so it's you know, kind of a purebred. And he said, you should know, are you willing to read some scripture? And so unlike most people who get turned on to John when they come to the faith, he sent me to Hebrews, and we started reading scripture together. And I started, my heart opened in understanding this is the key for me as a Jew who came to Christ. I'm still a Jew, Richard. That'll never, like, that doesn't change, right? And I think most people who are Jewish think, well, if I become a Christian, I've now converted. That's right. I'm not a Jew anymore. And that feels weird and not good, to be honest with you, because I love my Jewish heritage. And my grandparents and my great-grandparents who came from Ukraine, I didn't want to wipe all that out. And Tim said, no, Mark, actually, this is the completion of the promise. Your people were promised a Messiah, and the Messiah has come, and that's for you specifically. And that's really what opened my heart and caused me to start reading scripture. I've read the great apologetics. You know, I started with Lee Strobel, Case for Christ, start simple and basic, and all the way into C.S. Lewis and Chesterton, and then tons of scripture. And then I had no epiphany. It was literally just one day sitting at my desk thinking, you know, this seems true to me. Like, it just doesn't make sense not to believe this. And that's the day that I prayed for salvation. And, you know, I have no idea what I was doing. It's kind of a funny, you know, okay, Lord, I don't know how to do this, but I'm going to try. And this is the best day of my life and transformed my entire life. I'm happy to say my kids have both become Christians. It's deepened my wife's faith. And I've had the opportunity to give my testimony to a lot of people. And that's the most enjoyable thing that I could possibly do, is tell people how much I love the Lord and how much he's transformed my life.
Man, that is awesome, Mark. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'd love to take the rest of the show to talk about that and about the Jewish people and, you know, all of that. That's really near and dear to me. But I can't. We've got to talk about Convention of States and your work there, and what all of that is, because there are so many people that are not familiar with the movement yet, and it really does have incredible potential. So, you know, I'd like to just kind of dive into that if we can. And Convention of States, it's like, what is that? Are you actually wanting to scrap the United States Constitution? How could you do such a thing? But that's really not what you're doing. Can you kind of tell us what it's about?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest words he uses is we intend to restore the Constitution. Unfortunately, Congress, presidents, the federal courts, the Supreme Court have really torn our Constitution apart. The Constitution itself is 4,400 words, and we now have a Constitution because of Supreme Court interpretation that's literally over 3,000 pages long. In fact, I think I have one on my desk right here. Weighs about 10 pounds. It contains every Supreme Court case ever issued. And it says things to us about the Constitution that are clearly, blatantly untrue. The federal government had 17 enumerated powers when we began. Today, those powers number in the tens of thousands. It was never intended to be this way. And so the question is, what do you do if we agree federal government's out of control, the debt's out of control, these guys stay in D.C. and they were never meant to stay in D.C.? There's a couple of choices. One is we could ask them to give us our power back. They're never going to do that. No tyranny has ever returned power that it has accumulated to itself in all of human history. And so the question is, what do you do? And the framers gave us in Article 5 a method for the states and the people to rise up and to go around Congress and around the president and restrain federal overreach. And that's by calling a convention of states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, you know, we have, so far, we have 27 amendments to the United States Constitution. And all of those amendments were originally approved by Congress and then submitted to the states for ratification. Right. We've never used the convention. So the Article 5 has that option for amending where it gets passed by Congress, 2/3 majority, and then ratified by the states. But so no one, most average American doesn't know about this option, but Article 5 also says the states can come together and have a convention to propose amendments. And can you tell us more about that? What has to happen in order for a convention like that to occur?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, why? And the reason is, you know, people want term limits. People want a balanced budget amendment. People want the federal government to quit messing around in our private lives, in our personal lives, in our property, in our families, in our education systems. And the federal government, Congress itself, is never going to propose amendments which restrict their own power, their ability to spend, their own terms. So if we believe that those things are necessary, we're going to have to do that ourselves. And the process put forth was suggested on September 15th, 1787 by Colonel George Mason. They're in convention drafting the Constitution. 2 days before the end of convention, Mason stands up, says there's a problem. We gave the power to Congress, but not to the people acting through the states. And he asks, are we really so naive that we believe that a federal government, which is a tyranny, will propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny? Interestingly, Richard, there's no debate. Madison's notes say NINCOM, which was Latin abbreviation for no comment. And it's unanimously adopted to give us this power. And the way the power works, it's the same as Congress. It takes 2/3 of Congress to propose an amendment. It takes 2/3 of the states just to agree to get into a convention, and they have to agree on what the subject matter is. And once they get in convention, it takes 26 states to agree to propose an amendment. And when they do, that amendment is just a suggestion. And then it has to go out to the states for the same ratification method that Congress uses. You need 3/4 or 38 of the states to agree to ratify anything before it becomes part of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you have to get 2/3 of the state legislatures to agree to call for this convention or a petition for the convention, right? And so you've made a lot of progress so far. It's my understanding you've got how many? 19 states have approved this petition for a convention of states?
Yeah, 19 states. North Carolina is kind of on the cusp. We've passed it through the House there. We're just pending in the Senate. So hopefully by the end of this year, we'll be at 20 or 21 states. So well past the halfway mark to calling the first convention of states that's ever been held in the United States of America.
And you need a total of what? What would 2/3 be? 34?
34 states. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now when a legislature votes on this to approve the petition for a convention, does their governor have to sign it, or is it just the legislature?
Just the legislature, because it's done by resolution. It's not legislation. So no governors are involved.
Yeah, it's not a new law, so the governor doesn't have to sign it. Okay,
right.
Well, awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about why. Just dive in a little bit more deeply about this. Why don't you want? Why not go the regular route? If there's some amendments you think we ought to pass, why not get Congress to adopt them? Is it because of what you're saying that they're not going to?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not just because we think they're not going to, and this is really important. As Christians, I think if we read the Bible, we have an actual understanding of human nature, and that's the manual. And human nature tells us that people like power, and we accumulate power, and when we have power, we don't like to give up power. And this is just the story of all humankind. And so the idea that Congress itself is going to say, you know what, we'll just stop spending so much money. Or, you know what, we don't love being here in D.C. enough, and so we'll just term limit ourselves, right? Instead of serving 30 or 40 years, we'll make it 10 years or 12 years. They will never do that. In fact, we've seen attempts at this. They attempted a balanced budget amendment, a proposal out of Congress, and you can go watch the video of Congress cheering when they voted that down in the Senate. And so they're never going to do these things if we believe those things are necessary, which I think probably all of your viewers and listeners do. we're going to have to do those things ourselves.
And so let's say you succeed, and I'll believe with you that you're going to. If a convention gets held, how does the voting take place? Is it just like back at the original one, where it would be by state delegation? Like you would have to get a majority of the state. Like let's say where I am, Colorado. Let's say we had 6 delegates and or 7, take an odd number. You'd have to have 4 of those vote for whatever before the state of Colorado would be counted as in favor or against, right?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Every state can send as many delegates, they're actually called commissioners, as they desire, but the commissioners have to vote in their own delegation the way they want to cast their vote. So they need a majority in their own delegation. It's going to be up to each state how they choose their commissioners, how many commissioners they send. But it's important to remember this is a convention of the states, not a convention of the delegates. And so each state gets 1 vote. We know this because there have been over 41 to be precise, interstate conventions in American history. Never an Article 5 convention, but interstate conventions. And every single one of those has voted 1 state, 1 vote. In fact, the small states wouldn't participate unless that was how the voting occurred.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Okay, so and then you said that if an amendment got approved, it only takes a majority of the states in the convention, but that doesn't make it law. It has to go back to the state legislatures for ratification, just like the original Constitution.
Yeah, that's correct, and it requires even a higher bar. It requires 38 states to ratify. That is 3/4 of states, and that is what I describe as a super majority. It's an incredibly high bar, and this is one of the most important things to remember. You'll hear people say, this is risky, this is dangerous. I always encourage people, I give out my personal email address, which is mmeckler@cosaction.com. Sometimes people say, I'm scared, who knows what they're gonna do, they'll do something crazy. And I say, well, write to me with the amendment you're worried about, and then list the 38 states that will ratify that. And I've been saying that literally to millions of people over the years. I've never gotten an email because you just can't do it. And frankly, and this is important that we're realistic, that's true, you can't do it for something that would be very conservative, like exceptionally conservative, say a right to life amendment. You couldn't get 38 states for that right now, unfortunately. I'll keep praying for it and working on it. And you couldn't get an amendment repealing the Second Amendment. So it's going to be something straight down the center that the majority of Americans approve of, like term limits and a balanced budget amendment.
Yeah, that's why the Constitution hasn't been amended more than 17 times since the Bill of Rights, and is because it really is tough to get it done. Even the Equal Rights Amendment failed, and so many others. Well, so Mark, where are you guys in the process? Can you comment on that? We're going to take a little break here in about a minute, but before we go to the break, are you gaining momentum, losing momentum, sort of treading water? Where are we in this?
I would say every year is equally hard, and I wish it got easier and easier. There's opponents out there. Every single organization on the left has signed a press release against us. And when I say every, I mean, it's all the Soros orgs, it's Planned Parenthood, it's La Raza, it's MoveOn.org. So when I go into a legislature, we have the full weight of the left and all of their finances against us. Unfortunately, there's a couple of our brothers and sister organizations on the right that don't like this either. And so it's an uphill battle. I expect it to be hard. The framers wanted it to be hard. They didn't want it to be easy for us to amend the Constitution. So when I get frustrated, I just try to remember, okay, this is what they intended, and I'm in the fight that they expected.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's pick up on this when we get back. We're going to take a little break now and share some information with our viewers. It'll be about 90 seconds. Don't go away, guys. We're talking with Mark Meckler, who's the head of a Convention of States organization, about the call for a new constitutional convention to amend, not scrap, but amend the Constitution. And we're going to dive into more detail when we get back, so don't go away.
I want to give you a special invitation to join me for our Truth and Liberty Conference on September the 12th through the 14th. I tell you, these conferences are some of the very best meetings I have ever attended in my life, and this year we've got Dr. Ben Carson with us, Pastor Che Ahn, Bill Federer, Marjorie Dannenfelser, who's head of the pro-life organization in the United States, Rick Green, Luke Ball, Richard Harris, and myself. It's going to be a great, great time. here at our facility in Woodland Park. We're going to have workshops in the afternoon and just a lot of different ways to help equip you so that you can be salt and light in this society that we live in. Join us for our Truth and Liberty Conference, September 12th through the 14th in Woodland Park, Colorado.
Hey everybody, this is Richard Harris, Executive Director of Truth and Liberty. Recently we had our second annual awards banquet. I'm telling you, it was an awesome event. And this year we had many corporate and individual sponsors. Andrew Womack and I want to say thank you personally to each and every one of you who sponsored the event. We want to acknowledge your support. You know, our sponsors make it possible for us here at Truth and Liberty to educate, unify, and mobilize believers in Jesus Christ to affect the reformation of nations through the 7 mountains of cultural influence. And so to all of you, we just want you to know that your generous support helps us not only to proclaim the truth through our Truth and Liberty show, but also to continue offering biblical resources on our website, like the Pastor's Toolkit for Cultural Engagement. Also presenting powerful conferences every year where we're able to equip believers to be light and salt in their communities, and so much more. So God bless you. Thank you again for supporting Truth and Liberty. All right, well, we're back here on Truth and Liberty. Thanks for sticking with us. The rest of the show is really going to get interesting here as we dive into the specifics about the movement, the Convention of States movement, or Article 5 movement, as some people refer to it. And we've got, as our really special guest today, the founder and president of Convention of States, Mark Meckler. So, Mark, boy, you were making some amazing points there. You know, I think the biggest fear that people have that causes resistance is, well, wait, you're going to have a runaway convention, right? Once you open that thing, there's no limit on what amendments can be proposed. And man, today we're not as smart as the founders were back then, and we're not even as moral as they were back then. Who knows what kind of progressive garbage is going to come out of there? What's your answer to that opposition?
Yeah, there are a lot of layers in answer to that. I'm going to start with the end, which is the framers put together an incredible structure. Look, these were mostly men of God. They understood human nature really well. They were all very well versed in the Bible and in systems of government. And they created a structure that was meant to handle human nature. Now, if you look at our entire government structure, it was designed not for angels, but for men. This is what the framers told us. And by that, they meant sinful people. And so I don't expect that there aren't going to be bad people at convention. I just trust the structure. And what I mean by that is, first of all, you have 34 states have to agree in advance what the subject matter is. They have to set limitations. We've done that. The 19 states that have passed it so far all agree. We're going to talk about term limits, not just on Congress, but on the deep state as well, staffers and bureaucrats and judges. We're going to talk about a balanced budget amendment and things like tax caps and spending caps. And we're going to talk about the power of the federal government, the scope and jurisdiction, and how to limit that. And the language actually says anything that would limit the scope and power and jurisdiction of the federal government. So 34 states, Richard, in advance have to agree. That's all you can talk about. And so remember, a supermajority will agree in advance. These are the only things. Then you're going to get into convention. In convention, if somebody raises something that's not within that scope, well, somebody from a conservative state can raise their hand, point of order, say that's out of order, it's not within our mandate, and the president of the convention will gavel them out. Remember, that president will be elected by that supermajority, so he's going to represent those 3 planks. And then in the end, again, it takes 26 states to agree. The vast majority are going to be Republican states, relatively conservative states. Then it's got to get ratified by 38 states. So there are so many protections built in along the way. I have absolute faith in the framers. They knew what they were doing and they understood human nature.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so you've got two guardrails there. Your first one is that you have to define what the topics are going into it. So if someone brings up, oh, we're going to have reparations for slavery, or we're going to pass some law on abortion, those are both outside the scope of what you're talking about, and so those wouldn't even be considered. But the other thing is the idea that, yeah, whatever comes out still has to be approved by the 3/4 of the state. So what are you really worried about here, right? So I think those are really good arguments. And let's talk about these three issues that Convention of States, your organization, is proposing be addressed. Again, what's the first one, Mark? I'm looking at my notes here, but I'm not seeing it.
The first one would be, call it fiscal restraints on the federal government.
Okay, so balanced budget or limitation on taxing power. What specifically do you have in mind, or do you think would be the most likely proposals along those lines?
Yeah, look, I think all of us can agree that the federal government is out of control. We had a $14 trillion debt when I started doing this. It's now $34 trillion. So in the last decade, it's more than doubled. And that pace is accelerating. That is going to bankrupt the country. Our children and their children are already going to be burdened by this debt. So we have to do something. Polling shows us that 85% of Americans roughly are in support of some form of balanced budget amendment. We all know if we spend more than we take in, eventually something really bad is going to happen. Mm-hmm. That's true for the federal government as well as our own personal households. And so we have to do something to restrain it. So a balanced budget amendment of some kind. Along with that, I believe we need tax caps and spending caps, because otherwise they're just going to say, well, that's okay. We don't mind if you make us balance the budget. We'll just tax you to death. Mm-hmm. And so there has to be some sort of ceiling put on those things. Right now we have what we call the debt ceiling. It's not binding. They raise that every single year. So we need something constitutional that limits it. This will allow legislators to have an excuse for cutting spending. Otherwise, a legislator, they get nothing but grief when they cut spending. Nobody calls them up and says, thank you for cutting spending. People call them up and yell at them for cutting their favorite program. So this gives them the opportunity, the right incentive to say, look, I don't have a choice. This is what the Constitution says. This is what we have to do. So I think that's how you get fiscal restraints on the federal government. That is the first plank.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to a balanced budget amendment, I think any proposal along those lines has to have some kind of an emergency escape hatch, right?
Yeah.
So that if we're in a war or whatever, and the government has to borrow, that it has the power to do that. But would that be the point where it would be the toughest to reach some kind of an agreement in a convention? Is how do you define what that is? Whether maybe it's a 3/4 vote of Congress or some set of specified contingencies or something like that. But what do you think about that?
That is really correct. And look, I think the entire idea of a balanced budget amendment is complex. Mm-hmm. How do you define the budget? Where's the accounting come from so that it can't be fudged? I think this is going to be complicated. It's going to take experts in a convention, which is supposed to be a deliberative body. So I think it's the right forum for doing this. And I agree with you about the emergency hatch, but the problem is you have to make sure that that emergency button isn't so big that everything goes through it. Because frankly, Congress would just declare everything an emergency. Presidents would declare they're doing that right now, right?
Right, they're doing that. They did that with COVID, right? I mean, It's like, I can grab more power here. So
I think your suggestion is something along those lines is the correct suggestion. For example, it would take 2/3 or 3/4 of Congress would have to vote. It would need to be something that requires some form of bipartisan approval, because for example, if there's a world war taking place and we're being under attack, you're not going to have a problem getting 3/4 of Congress to agree to that. Now, if we're talking about something like whatever your opinion is on this funding for Ukraine, that's going to be a lot closer, right? And we may not be able to, and probably couldn't get to a 3/4 threshold. And I think that's important. If we're going to spend money on something outside of a balanced budget, it should take a very large consensus in order to do so.
Yeah, boy, that would have can you imagine the impact that would have on our government and on this runaway borrow and spend nonsense that's literally right. I think we're at 36 trillion, 38 trillion. Can't even keep up with it. The debt is accumulating so fast. And people that are watching are really concerned. How much longer do we have before this thing caves in on us? But Mark, what's the second category that you want to address at the convention?
The second category is term limits. And again, this is about an 85% issue with the American public. We look at Congress. Right now, just I don't even have to say it. Look at Joe Biden. Look at Mitch McConnell. It's not a partisan thing. Look at Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer. These are people who've been in politics 40, 50 years. And when people talk about term limits, that's the stuff that we're sick and tired of. And those people consolidate power. And this is what this is all about. The framers understood that people were flawed and we like to consolidate power. That's just part of human nature. And we need term limits to stand against that. And I think this is a really important distinction, though. Some people propose term limits for Congress alone. I think, and we think, that's very dangerous. If you term limit Congress, but not their staff, not the bureaucrats, then you're going to empower the staff and the bureaucrats. They already have way too much power. We shouldn't have these administrative agencies. So giving them more power would be a really bad idea. So our proposal allows room. It says federal officials. Anybody who works for the federal government could be term limited. And I think that's the way it should be. You shouldn't go to Washington, D.C. and have a 40-year career as a bureaucrat. I call this just euphemistically the Fauci Amendment. We should never have another Anthony Fauci who has accumulated that sort of power and influence, and we can prevent that with term limits.
Well, so yeah, that's really interesting. That we could talk about that. That gets real complicated. You've got 2 million or more federal employees. Just a few thousand are political appointees. Most of them kind of come and go when the new administration arrives. But what about the other 1.9 million? Let's say someone's been working for the Department of Commerce for 30 years, right? Or let's say 20 years, and they become a real subject matter expert, and suddenly they have to leave. Would that cause disruption? Would that cost us, expertise and efficiency? And what do you say to that argument?
I would say at this point in our history, you just use two words that don't go with federal government, which is expertise and efficiency. and so I think that was a legitimate argument. Back in the 70s, that became the heyday of big government. Nobody was arguing for smaller government in the 1970s. People were talking about economies of scale. I think at this point, we all understand that the federal government has become too large, too unwieldy. The experts have way too much power. And I think this is the important part. Almost every function that the federal government does is also done at the state level. And there are experts and efficiencies at the state level, and that's where the power was originally intended to reside. And the federal government has taken that power. And in fact, now we have duplicate agencies. Colorado has its own environmental agency, and now you have to comply with those rules and the rules of the federal government, and it shouldn't be that way. And that ties into, by the way, our third plank, which is limiting the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government.
It totally does tie into that, and I want to go there, but first let me ask you about term limits for judges. Is that on the table as well for federal judges? Because right now they enjoy, everyone says a lifetime appointment. That's not accurate. It's actually for a term of good behavior, which Congress regularly declines to exercise their supervisory jurisdiction there. But the point is that they stay in office for life. And do you want to change that? You think that should be changed as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, every study that's ever been done on the federal judiciary says it doesn't matter how conservative they are when they go in, they get more and more favorable to big government the longer they're there. The reason for that, again, this is not because of evil particular people. This is called human nature. A federal judge works for the federal government. The bigger the federal government's budget, the bigger their budget. The nicer office they have, the more staff they have, the more cases they can handle. And so it's just the nature of the judiciary to tend towards liberalism and big government over time. And I agree with you about life tenure. People say life tenure, and it meant on good behavior. And in the day of the framers, good behavior meant things like not swearing in public. Judges lost their office for swearing in public. Today, judges can do all sorts of things, and they're never removed from office. I think we need to start removing federal judges from office, but I think a good start would be putting a tenure on federal judges at a term limit.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been advocating for that myself for several years. I think there's Washington, D.C., or even if you're in any other part of the country, but there's especially the United States Supreme Court. It's in Washington, and there's an influence that happens to people in Washington, and it's this liberal drift. They'll go to Washington and they'll be principled conservatives, and then in 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years, you look at them and there's no resemblance to that conservative anymore. I'll give you some examples. I don't want to take your time, Mark, but being a lawyer, like most people don't realize that Roe versus Wade, for example, was authored by a Republican-appointed judge. Harry Blackmun was appointed by Richard Nixon. The gay marriage case, the deciding vote in it was Justice Kennedy, and he was appointed by, I think, Bush 1. Sandra Day O'Connor, appointed by Reagan, she authored that horrible decision that said that the government could take your property under eminent domain for just public good. It doesn't have to have a specific reason why it needs it, you know. And so this, I totally agree with that. I think that is one place where the founders did miss it. At least in the modern era, we need that. So anyway, that's my soapbox.
Yeah,
Sorry.
you know what? I want to add one more thing on the Supreme Court that I think is really important and why I would like term limits on the Supreme Court. Right now, when we have a Supreme Court fight, we have to nominate the youngest jurist that we can possibly get confirmed. Because we know they're going to sit on that bench for 30 years, 35 years, 40 years. And so you want to take your shot and have your influence over the longest period of time. Well, what that does is it removes the wisdom of age. There are jurists who are 60 years old, 65 years old. They've got long track records. We know they're solid conservatives. We know they're stalwarts who aren't going to drift on the court. And I would like to see us appointing jurists that are 60 years old instead of jurists that are 45 years old. Right now, you just can't do that. And if they were limited, say, to 12-year terms, then you could appoint older judges to the Supreme Court. And I just think that would be better for the country.
Well, here's a little bit of a, that's a great point. Here's another perspective on it. What would that do to, you know, when we do have a vacancy on the Supreme Court, it's all out war now.
Right.
It didn't used to be that way. It started with the Dems. Biden actually, under when Judge Bork was nominated by Ronald Reagan, he started that whole thing. And now they just rip these judges, these Supreme Court justices, to shreds. At least the left does. The conservatives still show some restraint on that, but it's a horrible process. I wonder if we had term limits on this, would that calm some of this stuff down? Because it's, you know, well, okay, we're going to have our share of appointments next time around, next year even, you know, because we know when they're coming up, we know when they're going to not be in office anymore, and maybe it would bring some more civility to the process.
I think the entire Convention of States process and what we're trying to do, take power away from D.C. and give it back to the states, removes the heat from the political system. One of the reasons there's so much heat in our system right now is the pressure relief valve of federalism has been taken away from us. Used to be, didn't matter all that much what happened in Washington, D.C. Even the president didn't matter all that much. Congress wasn't that important. When power resided in the state legislatures, and even more importantly to me, at the local level, then people didn't have intense fights about what was going on in Washington, D.C. Right now, that fight is appropriate about every Supreme Court justice because you're going to have that justice for 30 or 40 years. You never know who's going to appoint who. Like you said, if we were rotating, say that we limit it to 9, that's another thing I think we need to do by amendment. No more court packing discussion. Limit it to 9. Maybe you trade them out, you know, serve 12 years, so 3 of them are up at a time, let's say. That makes it much more balanced, and I do think that removes a lot of the heat from the system.
Wow, really interesting. Okay, so the third principle that the convention would address is reining in the jurisdiction and the scope of the federal government. Can you comment on that? What do you have in mind?
Yeah, to me, this is the most important one. What we're talking about here is the principle of federalism, about taking power away from the federal government, limiting their power and giving it back to the people in the states. This is the way the framers intended it to be. And so what we're talking about is getting back to close to the enumerated powers. I don't know that we'll ever get back exactly there. There were 17 enumerated powers in the original Constitution. The framers said anything that's written in there that is for the federal government and no more. 9th and 10th Amendment, everything else to the states and to the people. We've now flipped that on its head. So I'll give you some specific examples. The Department of Education is not constitutionally authorized. Energy, EPA, USDA, FDA, DEA, none of these are authorized. FBI, an interstate police force, none of these things are authorized by the United States Constitution. The federal government got the power to do all those things. It was granted by the courts and ultimately by the Supreme Court under broad interpretations of things like the Commerce Clause and General Welfare Clause. And these were essentially loopholes that the court ran through. We need to close those loopholes. And I'll give you a very specific one. Most of your listeners don't like the Department of Education. I don't. It hasn't done any good. We know by the numbers, hundreds of billions of dollars spent at best. Test scores haven't gone up at all. I think really it's done grave damage to our education system. Thomas Jefferson said to William Henry Lee in a letter that it would be unconstitutional for the federal government to spend money on education because it wasn't authorized by the Constitution. And Richard, I know you know the Constitution pretty well. I can't find the Education Amendment in there. That was invented by the courts. And we need to do away with all of those departments and return that power back to the states. So to me, this is the most important part. If you take the power away from the federal government, the politicians won't want to be there forever. It's not so exciting or sexy or powerful anymore. And we won't spend as much money because they won't have the power to spend the money. So I think taking the power away, limiting the power, that's the most important thing we can do.
Man, I totally agree with you. I teach constitutional law in our government school here at Harris, and you know, the limitation, the enumeration of powers, and the checks and balances of the Constitution is what has made our Constitution a model for the free world and has enabled it to be the longest lasting Constitution in the world. But it wasn't the checks and balances. What people need to understand is it wasn't just Congress versus the courts or the president. It was the states against the federal government too. The biggest check on the federal government was originally the states, and
Yes.
You know, the Supreme Court of the United States, to me, one of the worst things that it has ever done. You know, you've got Plessy versus Ferguson, and you've got all these, you know, other things. But one of the worst things it ever did was cave on the Commerce Clause. And as a lawyer, you know what I'm talking about. But in the 1930s, the court was saying, no, FDR, you can't do that because it's not listed in the Constitution. You can't do that. You can't do that. And so he threatens with the court packing, and they cave, saying, oh, yeah, this thing regulating interstate commerce, yeah, sure, okay, yeah, as long as it touches commerce, you can do whatever you want. Since that time, there has been very little serious challenge to anything the federal government wants to do. I don't even think members of Congress seriously ever consider, is this authorized under the Constitution? Because anything goes. They can regulate every aspect of our lives now, or at least they think they can. But,
yeah, you know what, I think you're hitting on what is a case in American history that very few people know of, regular folks who aren't constitutional geeks like us. Mm-hmm. That is one of the most important turning points in American history. It was called Wickard v. Filburn. Yeah. And look, just to give people kind of the surface view of that thing, the court said, if you don't engage in commerce, then we can regulate you under the Commerce Clause. I know that sounds insane, but this is literally what they said, because they said, like, you know, if you don't go out and buy something, well, that means that you didn't buy something, so it wasn't sold, and so now you affect interstate commerce. What that means is if you don't do something, you've done something, and that means we can regulate anything. That was pretty much what the decision said.
Yeah, exactly. And oh, that word interstate, well, don't worry about that. Pay no attention to that thing. That's not really relevant. You know, it's just crazy. But man, Mark, if you did that, if you somehow pulled that back, you're talking about shrinking the size of the federal government by 90%, maybe 80%. The military could stay intact, but the non-military portions of the government would shrink radically. What are your thoughts on that? How I mean, could we really do that?
You bring joy to my heart even saying it, Richard. Yeah, that is exactly what I intended. You know, people say, well, how would you do that? That's impossible, and things would be changed so much. And the reality is, it's not that big of a change. And the reason I say that is because every state does all of these functions already. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if you're in Colorado, every one of these departments I spoke of that we could get rid of at the federal government level, there is an equivalent department in the state of Colorado or That's Texas true. Or California or wherever. So all of those functions would simply transfer back to the states where they belonged in the first place. Now, what would happen that would be so transformative is obviously reducing the size and scope of the federal government, but it would also restore federalism, meaning that Colorado could be Colorado, Texas, Texas, California, California. This is what the framers intended, and this is the great safety valve in the American political system. You know, people think things are really rough right now, and we're so divided. Richard, we've always been this way. Before the American Revolution, after the American Revolution, all the way up through the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, the fights over the Vietnam War. We've been at each other's throats for the entire course of American history, maybe World War II accepted, and it's okay. We're a very diverse people, geographically, religiously, philosophically, ideologically. You can do that in a system of federalism. When you centralize all the power in Washington, D.C., it's like putting all that stuff, all those differences inside a pressure cooker, and at some point the pressure has to be relieved. It's either going to be relieved by the pot exploding, the country coming apart in a very violent way, or we're going to relieve that pressure by going back to federalism.
Well, you're talking about not an armed revolution, but a legal revolution in a way of restoring America back to what the framers intended. And I think it's a really exciting concept, and I think it could be it'd be like the dawning of a new age of liberty for not just America, but for the world. Really, if we curtailed the government back to, even the size that it was in 1930, people would absolutely not recognize the government. But Mark, so we've got a few minutes left in the broadcast. I do want to give you a chance to tell people how they can get involved and support what you're doing.
Yeah, so people can go to our website, conventionofstates.com. They can sign the petition, which will go to your state legislators and let them know that you're in support. By the way, that matters whether you're in a state where it's already passed or not, because they can always rescind. So it's important for them to know that there is still support in those states. I just spent the last couple of days in Utah, where they passed many years ago, but we're there meeting with legislators, letting them know to maintain their support. And by the way, this is important. We're involved in all kinds of stuff. Pro-life in the legislatures, pro-Second Amendment, pro-property rights, election integrity. We have the largest grassroots army on the ground in the state legislatures in the United States of America. So if you want to actually be engaged in a way that's effective, we don't ask you, just call your congressman. We're going to teach you how to be effective on the ground. And we're an organization that has a heart for God. That's the center of our organization. Most of us are believers. It's not a requirement in the organization, but that's just how it falls out. Then go to conventionofstates.com and get signed up. And there's one more thing I want to add, Richard, which is, you hear all that runaway stuff and everything. Understand all of that came from the left. Chief Justice Warren Burger, the guy who signed Roe versus Wade, is the guy that created the runaway convention argument, because he did not want Roe versus Wade overturned in a convention. So if you're afraid of it, understand those arguments come from the radical left. We are a people who have nothing to fear. We're told to be courageous and brave and not terrified nor discouraged, because we know the Lord our God is always with us. So we're going to be in that fight, and I think we're going to win that fight, Richard.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would ask people, how much worse would it need to get in America before we need a convention, right? I mean, do we have to have the country literally come into a state of civil war or armed rebellion or whatever? Do we have to have the federal government rounding people up and putting them in concentration camps? I mean, what's it going to take? And so I think we're far beyond that point, and reasonable minds ought to be able to agree on this. And I have learned so much from you, Mark, just listening today and also studying to prepare for this episode, that I've just become your newest fan. So I really do agree with it. And before we close, I wanted to mention, I was sitting here thinking about the story, the J.R.R. Tolkien story, The Lord of the Rings, and the ring. The ring loves, people love that power, don't they? That centralization of power. That is the spirit of Antichrist. And Frodo's journey was to destroy that ring, man. Whatever the obstacle, whatever the choice, it had to be thrown into the fires of Mordor. And you're on that quest, man. You're the same quest here. And by the way, we talk about that all the time. Our group that started this, we're big C.S. Lewis fans, Lord of the Ring, and Tolkien fans, and we talk about our entire goal is to take that ring and throw it into the lake of fire and break that power. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, the ring wants to be found. Remember this, what Gandalf said. So We've got to break that. America's not about that. It's about freedom, and you have to have decentralized power to have freedom. Well, we're out of time today. I'm so honored and blessed that you joined us, Mark. Thank you so much. I want to have you on again real soon, and I look forward to seeing you when you're out in Colorado. Thanks to everybody for watching today. Be sure to go to the Convention of States website, check it out, sign up to volunteer, and sign their petition and everything else. God bless you all. We'll see you next time on Truth and Liberty.
Thank you for joining today's Truth and Liberty livecast. You can watch today's and past livecasts in our archives at truthandliberty.net. Our goal is to educate Christians and connect them with resources and organizations to help them impact their sphere of influence. You can help us accomplish this by making a donation at truthandliberty.net/donate. Join us next time for more Truth and Liberty.